and it's a pleasure to be here. I've been to Oregon a number of times, going back even before the APS existed, and I don't mean the American Physical Society. In fact, was looking for a site to do some work in quantum chaos, and I thought I might wind up doing it at the APS. And instead, I wound up at Berkeley, so I won't talk about that. Let me begin just by telling you a little bit about how I got involved in the nuttiness of Washington, and I'll condense it down. It's a long story, which I'll make very short. I had no interest in politics when I was growing up, although I have to confess that I lived in an area, I grew up in Brooklyn, and my father was a conservative, at least by comparison with everybody else who lived there. He was a socialist, everybody else was a communist. But I grew up in a home where we got 4 newspapers a day, and required listening to the news every night on the radio. This is before TV, well, we didn't have a TV, that was the problem. My father didn't believe in the TV. In any case, when I was in graduate school, this was at the time when you had to be 21 years old before you could vote. And I had graduated from college, I had barely turned 20, and I was in graduate school, and you were not allowed to vote where you went to school. You had to go back to where you grew up. And so I made a trip to New York, and I wanted to register. I said, fine. A friend of mine said, remember to take your diploma with you. So I took my college diploma, and this woman looked at it, and she said, what's that? I said, well, that's my college diploma. And she said, well, that's not acceptable. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, you have to have a high school diploma. So I looked at her and I said, you gotta be kidding. I don't know where it is. She said, well, then we have to give you a literacy test. So I had to read, I think it might have been from the Gettysburg Address. I can't quite remember. And I passed. At which point, this woman said to me, now you have to join a political party. And I said, I don't have any interest in a political party. She said, well, then you can't vote. Now, I knew that was not true. So we had a long argument, and of course, at this point, I was really you had to have a literacy test and all that. And so I said, oh, she said, well, you don't have to. I said, no, you made the point, I will join a party. So I joined the Republican Party. This was an area which was 99% Democrats. And I knew that, and I knew that she was a Democrat, and so I said, I'll be Republican. So that, in short order, led to some very interesting things. I was asked to work for John Lindsay, who was running for mayor of New York, as an insurgent anti-corruption candidate. Both parties were corrupt in those days. Well, not much has changed, of course. And so I did that. Then I wound up, I got a phone call from Nelson Rockefeller's campaign. And by the way, campaigns in those days lasted 6 to 8 weeks, if you can believe this. That was it. Started on Labor Day, Election Day it ended. And so I was assigned by the Rockefeller campaign to an election district in Brooklyn, where I had grown up, which was 98, 99% Democratic, and they gave me a couple of people to do the field work. I would go from Yale to New York every on the weekends. Rockefeller carried that district. It was remarkable. So now I had some cred. Jack Javits, who was the senator, known as the dean of the Senate at the time, was running for re-election, and so he contacted me, or his campaign did, and asked me to do policy work on environment. So that was my first experience with policy. And then I worked for a couple of other members of the Senate, and the Republican Party did a weird thing. It made a very sharp turn to the right, and I simply found that I couldn't deal with that, and so I dropped out, and then more than a decade later, I switched party affiliations. I became a Democrat. I didn't change. I mean, I have to say, I don't think my views have changed very much over my entire lifetime. The political parties in this country have. And that's part of the problem that we're facing. So anyway, I wound up doing some work for the Clinton-Gore campaign in 1992. I was a regional coordinator and then a surrogate speaker. And I'm at CCNY. Harry Lustig had been the provost there. Harry retired. He went to the American Physical Society as the treasurer, publisher, and acting executive officer. 1994, he calls me and he said, Michael, things in Washington are in really bad shape. You know the people in the White House, come down and fix it. I said, you want me to fix the White House? He said, well, somebody's got to do it. So I had a sabbatical coming up. I was supposed to go to Berkeley, and the beamline at the Advanced Light Source was not yet ready. And so I wound up going to Washington. I said, I'll see what I can do for a year. No one was doing science advocacy at the time. The only advocacy that had taken place was the superconducting supercollider, where that led. And so the question was, how do you do science advocacy for a nonprofit? You can't endorse candidates. You can't contribute money. You can't even publicize voting records. And so we began putting our heads together. Of course, this is now a cottage industry in Washington. There are lots of people who do it. But back in 1994, no one was doing it. Of course, in the 1994 election, Republicans took control of Congress for the first time in 40 years. So Harry called me. He said, okay, wise ass, what are you going to do now? It's Republicans. I said, don't worry, Harry. I was a Republican in New York for many years. I'm just going to go up to Capitol Hill and tell people what I had done for the Republican Party, which I did, and doors opened. So that's the brief summary of how I got to be where I am. All right. Let me now start to, this is an interesting subject. What is the 21st century going to be in terms of science? And these are competing statements. You probably know the name Craig Venter, Human Genome. And this is what he said about 10 years ago. If the 20th century was the century of physics, the 21st century will be the century of biology. Now, 4 years before he said this, Harold Varmus, how many of you know Harold? Okay. Nobel laureate, former director of NIH, former head of Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital. He's now head of the director of the Cancer Institute at NIH. He went from the top, I don't know what he did, but anyway, he's there now. This is what he said. And this was in an op-ed in the Washington Post, and basically pointed out that all the sciences are interdependent. You cannot really say this is biology and this is physics. Everything has to work together. And that is, I think, correct. I don't agree with that. I more or less align with Varmus. Now, some other people have said, well, is science dead? I mean, you get some of these questions from people in Washington. Are there any discoveries to be made? Well, of course, the Higgs, not too long ago. In fact, I just got back from CERN, and things are going splendidly there. Neutrino oscillations. I mean, so this is, one of the things that we worry about today is the globalization of science, internationalization. How do we deal with large projects and so forth? So the neutrino oscillation experiment at Daya Bay, which, as many of you may know, produced some extraordinary results. Mars exploration. There's water on Mars. We didn't know this. We suspected that there might be. In fact, there is so much water on Mars now that if we do eventually send astronauts to Mars, which I'm not sure is a wise thing to do. By the way, one of the interesting questions that came up, the question was posed, we're looking for people who would be willing to go to Mars knowing that they might not come back, or if they did, they'd be dead. They got a lot of volunteers. It was amazing. But there's enough water there to sustain life. In other words, you don't have to cart it there with you. So, that's, we got this from the Curiosity rover, and amazing stuff. So anybody who challenges me to say, well, what is science doing? We are really making major discoveries. Then, of course, ultrafast spectroscopy. This is the LCLS at SLAC. I did a lot of work at SLAC, but not on this. That was in my era as a high-energy physicist. And then, of course, I can't help but point out that there was some work done here, too. The G-protein coupled receptor, which got the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2012. And, of course, that used, at least one of the recipients did his work at the Advanced Photon Source. The other recipient, by the way, was at Columbia University. He advanced 1 year beyond me. He was smarter. He got out faster. That was Bob Lefkowitz. All right. So, the physics trenches or the science trenches, whatever you want to call them, they're really working well. Not so much in Washington. And if I look back at the last few years and ask, what's happened? It's very little. Very little. So, just to give you an idea of how bad this can get, this was your senior senator in Illinois made this observation. Dick Durbin said, this was last year, just about this time last year, he said, the pinnacle of success last year, legislatively, was the helium bill. Now, I don't know whether all of you know about this, but the federal government does some weird things. It established a helium reserve way back at the time the military thought that dirigibles were going to be the future. And then in the early 60s, decided that perhaps because it's not a gas that you get very easily any place except from a few fields, natural gas fields in the United States and also in Russia, put helium into a reserve. Now, the nice thing about the way Washington does business is that if it costs money, don't admit it. And so they carried this thing on the books as a loan. Started with $20 million. By 1994, the bill on this thing, just because of the interest accrued on it, $1.4 billion. I mean, it was a fiction, right? But that's how it appeared on the books. And so there was a big push to sell off the helium reserve. Recapture the money so you can pay off the $1.4 billion debt, which started as $20 million. And 1996, there was legislation passed that effectively did just that, and it said at the point where that $1.4 billion is paid down, everything shuts down. The reserve shuts down, the pipe infrastructure, everything shuts down. Well, that payoff occurred October of last year. And everything would have shut down, not only the reserve, but also a lot of that infrastructure, and effectively would have eliminated roughly half the helium available for anything. And of course, today we use MRI machines, semiconductor processing, as well as the things we do in low-temperature physics. So Congress started to debate this. Now, this was a no-brainer. There was no political opposition on either party. This is something that has to be done. Well, not so fast. Doc Hastings, who was the chair of the House committee overseeing this in the state of Washington, decided, this is a great opportunity for an earmark. Earmarks are not allowable, but you can sometimes do something in weird legislation. So he put in an earmark for the state of Washington. Now the bill goes over to the Senate. Ron Wyden from Oregon has the chair there. And he took a look at this. He said, well, if Hastings is asking for an earmark, I may as well also. I'll actually put some in Washington and most of it in Oregon. All hell broke loose. The conservatives said, we're going to kill the legislation. So now we're down to 1 week out, and there's still no bill. It finally came together within that last week. Crisis legislation. And it was crucial. And that was what led Durbin to say this, because nothing else happened. Okay, why? What is the problem? Well, if you look, this is the current Senate. Democrats 53, Republicans 45, and then there were 2 independents who tend to vote with Democrats. So, well, that's easy. The majority is 55 votes, but you can't get anything done in the Senate these days unless you have 60. That's sort of the rule. The only thing that doesn't require 60, as what was called the nuclear option, the president can nominate appointees, and they can be approved by a simple majority vote. Of course, they're not, because senators can put holds on nominations. And as a result, that's one of the reasons, for example, today, there is no undersecretary for science and energy research in the Department of Energy. There is no confirmed director of the Office of Science, because somebody doesn't like something. Not the person, something else. And so these things get held up. So typically you need 60 votes. And of course, there aren't 60 votes. What's going to change? Well, this is the result of the election. There's still 1 Senate seat outstanding in Louisiana, which I think is going to wind up, that's to be determined, as a Republican. So the split then is going to be roughly 45 people who vote on one side, Democrats, 55 Republicans. So there's a flip from what it was. Doesn't matter. Nothing's going to change. If you look at the House of Representatives, their simple majorities work. And this is the current status. This is 2014. But there's a problem that the Republicans have faced. And that is, even though they've got 233 votes currently in the House, and they operate on what is called the Hastert rule, one of your guys, this state. What's the Hastert rule? The Hastert rule, when Denny Hastert was Speaker of the House, he determined he would not bring up any piece of legislation that could not pass solely with Republican votes. You had to be able to do it with Republican votes solely, otherwise it doesn't come to the floor. Well, you could. 233, it's 435 members, a few vacancies right now, but you need 218, so that's fine. No, because within the Republican Party there is a fringe, which we typically call the Tea Party. The numbers is a little bit fuzzy. 40, 50, we don't. These are self-identified people. Well, you subtract even, take 40 out of that, now you're down to 193. Hastert rule, so nothing goes through. Is that going to change? Well, the Republicans are extending the majority in the House, but they still don't have the clear majority without the Tea Party. And just to give you an idea of what's happened just in the last couple of days, so as you all know, the president moved ahead with executive orders on immigration. This thing has created a big flurry among Republicans in Washington. We somehow have to block this thing and so on. They campaigned on it. So the Speaker recognized that you don't want to shut the government down over that because the Republicans are going to get blamed for it. So he said to his colleagues, look, we can't do that. And so they came up with a plan for the coming year. Right now, just for another week, the government is funded through a continuing resolution, and the plan on the table in the House of Representatives is called a cromnibus. The CR does not stand for crap. It stands for continuing resolution. What's a cromnibus? A cromnibus is a combination of a continuing resolution, which doesn't change spending patterns, doesn't have any policy built into it, combined with an omnibus bill where everything else gets dumped into it, and of course nobody reads it because it's too big, and then all sorts of weird things can happen. So they said, we'll do this, and we'll pass almost everything for the government except Homeland Security, under which the immigration stuff falls, and then we'll come back to immigration a few times next year and just stick it to the president. And so the Republicans came out of their caucus, and that was all set. And even on the Senate side, the Democrats said, okay, let's just do it. That was 2 days ago. Yesterday, these folks rebelled. And they said, we didn't get elected to hand the president a victory. In fact, we got elected because we opposed the president. So we're not going to support it. 233 now, it's current Congress, even 244, they can't get it done. They can't get it done unless they appeal to Democrats. Break the Hastert rule. Well, the Democrats are sitting there and saying, now we got you. They don't like the legislation, and so they have now said, you know something, this is your mess, you fix it. So that's why things don't work. If you try to ask the question, are there areas where Republicans and Democrats can get together on things? This was done by a group called VoteView. They did analysis of voting records and where members of the Senate come from, what the states are, and looked to see where there is an overlap. Well, that was back in 2011, 2013. This is the current overlap in the Senate. You have to look very closely. The House of Representatives is the same thing. Nothing. So if you ask and the two parties work together, it's really hard. Right after the election, you probably heard the pledge of the president, I'm going to work with Republicans, we're going to work with the White House. Forgive me, when you've got a problem like this, where people their views are different, and quite frankly, there is no percentage for, there's no gain in cooperation if you're a politician. Think about this. What happened in 2014? The Democrats got their asses kicked, pure and simple. How come? Well, the Republicans spent the last 2 years bashing the president, and the public doesn't, we know what the president's approval rating is, somewhere in the low 40s, around 40%. So they nationalized the election. Why would they do anything different? They won. They won big. So you say, well, what about the Democrats? Well, the Democrats, most analysts say the Democrats lost the election principally because they did not campaign on any of the successes. Health care, economic recovery, the auto bailout. They walked away from everything. Now they've recognized that. So they're moving in, let's see, do I have this right? They're moving to the left, and the Republicans are moving to the right. Well, if you're looking at me, you got to figure it out. Okay. So going forward in the next 2 years, there isn't really much of a reason, if you're a politician, to change your behavior. And that's the problem. Now, let me just give you a few pointers. Some of you know this, so I apologize if you've seen some of this before. The budget. But it's actually fairly simple to look at. As you heard, discretionary budget, that's where money for this lab comes from. And this is back in 1970. Mandatory programs. What does that mean? Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, a few Veterans Affairs things, and little bits and pieces elsewhere. Then there's net interest on the debt. And then you come forward, I just do it 40 years, and this is still the same sort of thing. What you'll notice is that the blue, the discretionary, used to be about 2/3, and the red, the mandatory, about 1/3. Now it's flipped. Well, I didn't draw these pies, to indicate the size of the budget. But there's a very interesting bit of history. This, of course, in the 1960s, this was the space race. So forget about that. I mean, it's just there. Scroll forward to the mid-'70s. What I'm plotting here is total R&D over total discretionary spending, that's the gray square box. Non-defense R&D over non-defense discretionary spending, that's the blue triangle. For the most part, it's flat. Now, this is kind of weird if you want to think a little bit about it, because R&D is spread all across the federal budget. Virtually every federal agency has some R&D in it. I mean, some bigger than others, obviously. Defense has a lot of the D. NIH is a big spender. But when the dust all settles, for reasons that no one really understands, the numbers always work out this way. So the question then is, if we are going to continue to expand the mandatory part of the budget, and we're not expanding the budget overall, which is not, we're not going to, then there's a squeeze on spending, which is going to be reflected in R&D, unless there's an epiphany and people say, well, you know something, we got to carve out a special place for science. And so that's our challenge, to make that case. What about the future? Well, as I indicated to you, spending is going to be constrained. We all heard about this grand deal, the bargain, taxation, and it fell apart. It fell apart. There was a commission. The Simpson-Bowles or Bowles-Simpson Commission had made a series of recommendations, and the president decided, even though the commission made the recommendations, he didn't like it. And then there was this business of 12 members of the House and the Senate getting together. In fact, one of your representatives in the area, Jan Schakowsky, was on that. And the idea was to come up with something that would allow the government to function well. That failed. There was a poison pill put into this thing to force that 12-member committee to come up with a deal. And it was known as sequestration. Sequestration meant across-the-board spending cuts. Roughly speaking, 11% or so for defense, and about 8 to 9% for non-defense. And that happened. And there was a lot of pain. Some of the labs, of course, I don't know the details at Oregon, but I assume there were layoffs associated with this. There certainly were at some of the other, at LBL, I know that was the case. And then there were some people who said, you know, this is dumb. So they struck a deal. For 2 years, sequestration went away. It comes back in, by the way, in FY16. And nobody knows what's going to happen yet. The only thing we can say is it is unlikely we're going to see large spending. So we're operating in a very constrained environment. This brings up another issue. This year's election was largely a populist election. What do I mean by that? I mean that the people who campaigned successfully campaigned on issues essentially how your life is it being affected by current policy and what can be done to change your life, not the country. Look, the economy has been growing. Maybe not as fast as some people would like, but certainly faster than almost any other part of the world. Growing at about 2.5% a year, a little bit higher. The problem is, most people don't see it. Most people, but for 30 years, the income of the average person in the United States has gone down. That's a remarkable thing to keep in mind. Over Democratic administrations, Republican, anything, it's just gone down. So when you go out there and you tell somebody the economy is doing well, they'll say, yeah, for you, for Wall Street. So if you don't have investments, or you're not there, and I'll tell you another story about I should say this. There was a very interesting article that came out in the Harvard Business Review in September, and I commend it to you. It was written by Bill Lazonick, who's an economist. And he took a look at what American corporations are doing with their profits. And remember, profits have been soaring in the last 4 years since the recovery really got going. Got any clue where those profits are going? I mean, other than Apple keeping it all overseas or some other companies, but the stuff that is actually in the United States. What do they do with their money? Anybody have any idea? Who said that? Buybacks. See, you got it. Stock buybacks. 80% of American corporate profits are going into stock buybacks. See, why? Very simple. In 1982, the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, changed the rule that said it is allowable for insiders in companies to trade on the knowledge of when they're going to do buybacks. So CEOs, of course, today get paid a lot in terms of stock options. And they know that if there's a buyback, the stock price goes up. So they structure everything so they can exercise the options, because sometimes there's a 5-year limit on what stock price goes up, they sell their stock, and they become very wealthy. And that's the driver. Less money for infrastructure within companies, for capital expansion. R&D is going down because the driver in this, as Lazonick has analyzed it, really does not support not only long-term R&D, that's gone, but now R&D at all. So that's what we're facing in industry. I don't know, Steve, whether you see that in your company, but many companies are doing this. And that's a problem. So populism, what does it mean? It's a political philosophy that supports the rights and power of the people in their struggle against the privileged elite. And I'll remind you that this is not something that's new in the United States. It was there during the framing of the Constitution. There were proponents of including science in the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, for example. Benjamin Franklin wanted science mentioned. But the problem is, science at that time was regarded as the province of the elite. The average person was not knowledgeable about science. The average person really didn't have any interest in science, not educated in it. They won. So if you look at the Constitution, the only time you're going to find science mentioned is in the context of patents and copyrights. That populism ebbs and flows and grows. I mean, sometimes it's stronger and sometimes it's weaker. We're now living, at the moment, in a populist era. The challenge for us as scientists is to say we're not part of the privileged elite. We're really here to do work that we think benefits the individual. And I think we've got stories to tell. But we've got to adapt. I mean, we can't talk about science and technology or 70% of the driver of the increase in the gross domestic product. People don't understand that. So we'll come back to this at the end. Now, just a couple words about what the public thinks. And this goes back 4 years, and I don't think much has changed. Science is important, although, I mean, for example, you look today at what people say about climate change, 80% of the public today believes there's a problem. Now, it is split. The Democrats are probably closer to 90 or 100%, and the Republicans are down at 50 or 60, but it's still a large percentage. More than 2/3 actually believe that it is appropriate for the federal government to spend money on science, although there was a conference at the Cato Institute yesterday. This is a libertarian think tank. They've been on this hobby horse for a long time, saying the only reason that corporations don't spend money on research today is they believe the federal government is going to take it over, and so they can just say we don't have to do it. Of course, Norm Augustine, the retired CEO of Lockheed Martin, tells a story. He says that's absolutely incorrect. And Norm is a conservative. He's a Republican. He's very conservative. And he says, look, let me tell you a story of what would happen when I became CEO of Lockheed Martin. This goes back more than a decade. He said, I sent to New York, to Wall Street, my number 2 guy, to go and talk to the analysts, because he said we had a great plan for a 5-year R&D program to make Lockheed Martin the envy of the world in terms of military technology. So this guy goes up to Wall Street, and Norm's telling me the story, and he said, as he's speaking about this, the room begins to empty. So he turns to one of the guys, and he says, what's going on here? He said, they're all going out to sell their stock. And Lockheed Martin's stock fell 11% in one day because they had a 5-year R&D program. So, the libertarians basically say that's not an issue, because if the government didn't do the work, even though Wall Street won't tolerate it, corporations will do it. I don't happen to agree, but that's, it's a matter for debate. All right. The other problem, though, that we have, the first 2 are okay. The problem that we have is the public has no concept of how science affects their lives, except for one thing, medicine. They think doctors discover things and cure diseases. Of course, as we know, it's far more complicated. As a result, if you give people a choice of a dozen or more programs in the federal budget to cut, science winds up being number 2. It's actually number 1 for everybody except Democrats. Democrats, it's number 2. For everybody else, it's number 1, because they don't see the benefits. So, okay, we don't have money. We can afford to put this on hold. But in fact, when CBS a while back did a survey, and they asked people, do you have any idea where research is done? Not, Argonne or Oak Ridge or Brookhaven or whatever, but what institutions do research? And the number is startling. Anybody want to make a guess as to what percentage of people can even answer that question? 10%. 90% of the public had no idea where research gets done, whether it's in industry, whether it's at national laboratories, universities, or any place. They had no idea. So we got a lot of work to do to inform people. The trust in government, by the way, it's not just government, in all big institutions, from Wall Street to big business to government. People don't trust anything that's big. So if you ask about, what are we going to do, you can't talk big. Got to talk small. Now, in spite of what happened in this election, we also know that more than 50% of the voters, and we saw this thing in polling before the election, also in exit polling, if people felt they actually had a choice, they'd kick their own representative out. They don't feel they have a choice. So they hold their noses and vote. This is not good for democracy. In fact, the voter turnout in this last election was just over 33%. Except in my home state of Connecticut, where it was about 55%, for reasons that have a whole lot to do with the way in which government officials and people do things in that particular state. But for the most part, people stayed home. They're disgusted, and they don't think anything's going to change. And they're right to feel that way. Now, why does this matter? Why am I talking about the public? I mean, if we think about it, talking about discretionary budget spending on things, why am I talking about the public? Well, it's very simple to me, I think. When spending is rising, federal spending goes up, then you can talk to people in Washington and you can make a case for science or whatever your interest is, and you'll get a hearing. And so I say the inside game works. And I will just give you a very simple example of the inside game. And that has to do with the 2009 stimulus package, which was, benefited, for example, the national laboratories. How did that happen? It was a total of $22 billion. So I'll give you this story very quickly. Right after the 2008 election, Don Lamb, who at the University of Chicago, some of you, of course, know him, Don had worked on the Obama campaign. And I knew Don, and he called me afterwards and said, "What do you think we should be doing?" And I called my friend Bert Richter, the former director of SLAC, and another guy who was Mike Telson, been the former chief financial officer at DOE. And we met in Washington and said, why don't we propose, because there was a stimulus bill being discussed, why don't we propose making science part of it? And we ran that up the flagpole to see what would happen. The transition team said, that's fine. Give us a list of shovel-ready projects. You got to get the money out in 90 days. It's got to be spent essentially in 180 days. So we did that. By the way, with no cooperation at that time from the Bush administration, but we managed to get the information. We put together $1.5 billion, and then the word came back, well, make it money out in 1 year to be spent in 2 years, and so that went from 1.5 to 3, and then they said, well, actually you can go out in 2 years to be spent in 3 years, so we're up at $5 billion. And we're doing this thing in the APS, American Physical Society office in Washington, just sitting around a table. And then I was at a dinner, and a friend of mine who's a member of Congress, and Nancy Pelosi, who was the speaker, was there. And I started, and she's interested in science, and I started telling her about the story. And she said, why $5 billion? I said, well, that's what we came up with. She said, why don't you make it 10? I said, when do you need this? She said, day after tomorrow. So we went back, worked, for the next 2 days, put together a $10 billion package. Passed the House. Now it goes over to the Senate. They needed 60 votes. Arlen Specter, who's no longer alive, was a senator from Pennsylvania, was Republican at that time, and he was a big supporter of NIH. He said, I'll tell you what, I'll give you my vote to get to 60 if NIH gets $10 billion. And where the other two came from, I don't know. But that's how it happened. It was a small group of us sitting around figuring out what to do. That's the inside game. We knew the people, and we were able to accomplish something. But that only works when budgets go up. When budgets go down, now, if you're a member of Congress, the first thing you're going to do is to say, okay, if I'm going to screw some of my constituents, who's going to scream loudest? Because I'm not going to do that, because they won't vote for me again. So everybody looks to see where the public support is. And so if the public support for science, or at least the federal support of science, or the public support of the federal support is not there, we're in trouble. So we have to focus on the public. I'm just going to give you a snapshot of this stuff. And what I want you to look at on the next few graphs, you don't have to look at the details. I want you to look at the colors, which have nothing to do with politics. There's gray, which is a presidential request, action by the House, action by the Senate. This is subcommittees because nothing's passed in the Senate. And all I want you to notice in this is that these things are all over the map. This is for the Office of Science. You can look at anything else. Energy programs. There's no agreement. This is defense. Again, the Senate wants to boost basic research. The House wants to cut it. The President wants to cut it. You go through the list of these things. So just look at the variation. NSF. Well, actually, NSF doesn't look bad. But NSF has a different problem, which I'll get to in a moment. But when you have these variations and everybody's got to come together on the same page, it's really tough. NASA, same problems. So if you ask, how do people come to agreement? With a lot of difficulty. Now, This is for your bedtime reading, and I'll make all these slides available so you can put yourself to sleep by looking at the next table. I will make an observation. I'll just make an observation. If you look at fiscal year 2015, it doesn't look terrible. I mean, science, people will say, let's at least keep it even, maybe a little bit of an increase. There are some places where there's a disagreement, as I showed you on that previous slide. So that's my green and white, meaning, well, a little bit increase here. Some people want to keep it the same. Here's something that's completely flat. The major research equipment facilities and construction account at NSF, flat. And then there are a few places where there are disagreements whether increase or decrease, as I pointed out there. And then a couple of things where everybody says, cut it. One of them is high energy physics. That's another subject, which I spoke about at length when I was at Fermi Lab a few weeks ago. Now, what I said about NSF is illustrated in this slide. One of the things that I do is I write a column for Roll Call, which is one of the Capitol Hill newspapers. I write it on science and politics. No one was doing it, and so my press secretary called the editor, and they said, oh yeah, we'll give it a shot. And so I've been doing this. I do it roughly every other month. And so I wrote a piece about the far right. That doesn't mean the whole Republican Party. That's kind of that Tea Party group. But to point out that it won't help the economy. And I pointed out that the chair of the House Science Committee was not in control of his minions. I gave him a little bit of a pass on it. I think he is in control. I don't think he cares. But he responded, which was very, very interesting, because members of Congress rarely, ever respond to an opinion piece. This guy did, Lamar Smith did, and he did not refute anything I had said in my column. All he said is it's partisan rhetoric, which it was not. I quoted facts. And I'll just give you an idea of what some of those facts are, and I'll let you be the judge. So here is, by the way, these bills have not passed. So these things have been drafted. National Science Foundation, was written into legislation. Okay? You get 5 years of funding from NSF for your entire lifetime. That's it. Retire. If you submit a proposal, you cannot have more than 5 citations of your own work. They have requested, the Science, Space, and Technology Committee has requested the reviews, the referees' reviews of 50 different proposals. Now, as all of us know who've done any of this kind of work, when you review something, you expect that your name will not be divulged. And so you're free to say things that you might not otherwise say. And if you have obviously proposed by somebody very prominent, you might not want to admit that you're saying something bad, even if it's deserved. So anonymity is extraordinarily important, I think, to our enterprise, although there are people who argue that it shouldn't be. But I think the community, for the most part, overwhelmingly believes that this works pretty well. So NSF has resisted, and they said, if you want to come up and look at the proposals this is to the committee staff, we'll be happy to make them available, but you can't take them with you. And you can't write down the names of the reviewers. And the committee staff said, oh, don't worry about that. There are never any leaks in Congress. The result of this is that Eddie Bernice Johnson, who's the ranking Democrat on the committee, wrote a letter to the chair that was so vitriolic. I don't think I have ever seen one member of Congress criticize another member of Congress, certainly in leadership positions, the way she did in that letter. So that's there. Then there's also another piece. that says NSF should redirect its mission to national needs. So you want to do discovery science? Sorry, Charlie, that's not in one of the national needs. So this is a wholesale change that is being proposed with National Science Foundation. Of course, the Department of Energy is not exempt either. So this is language in the bill. And I have to tell you, it was fascinating. I was reading the bill. It was 96 pages long. And I get to the section on fossil fuels, which ordinarily I don't spend a lot of time reading. And then I found this under the fossil fuel section. No results from DOE-supported research may be used by any government agency for carrying out assessments or developing regulations. What the hell is going on? In other words, do scientific research, but nobody can use it, at least not in government. So you can judge who's right or wrong. Of course, I'm sure Lamar Smith would have a different narrative, but this is mine. All right, and by the way, and I say this, that Republicans traditionally have been the biggest supporters of science. And something is changing, and that's not good. Let me end by talking about messaging. I mentioned earlier that we're living in a populist era. So what do? Instead of talking about growing the economy, because people say, screw it, I don't see it. You have to talk about creating jobs. And science does that. I mean, not for us as scientists, but it is the driver of high tech. High tech does create a lot of jobs. I mean, Apple may build a lot of its computers elsewhere, but go into an Apple store, you see a lot of people working there. And they got lots of stores. Instead of talking about improving health care, people really don't understand what that means. And one of the problems, for example, with the Affordable Care Act is that's health care. Talk about saving lives. Your life. We talk about improving quality of life. I mean, these are the words that you see in all sorts of stuff that circulates in Washington. Science improves the quality of life. Most people have no idea what that means. So, use an illustration. You go into a supermarket, you don't want to spend your time in a long line waiting to check out. Laser scanners help you get out of there faster. So you talk about something that people encounter in their daily lives. This is another one that I love. Fuel efficiency. First of all, most people have no idea what the word efficiency means. I mean, it's sad. But keep in mind, you know, that less than 30% of our population gets a college degree today. And so efficiency, who knows what it means. So instead of that, more miles per gallon. That's something people can understand. You got to use language that resonates with the average person. Also, we talk about social media. Now, I would ask, if you speak to somebody on the street and say, how are you doing with your social media? You're going to get a lot of stares. But if you ask about Facebook, or you ask about Twitter, you're going to get a different response. It connects. Now, I'm not going to say this is a good thing or a bad thing. I think there's some terrible things associated with what goes on with Facebook. But the fact of the matter is it does help connect people. Maybe we should be doing it in a different way, but a lot of people love it. So you have to talk about connecting people, how you communicate with your friends and your family. And then images. Words, by the way, let me just, before I get to the images, let me just make one of my favorite books that I recommend to people was written by Frank Luntz, who is a Republican political advisor, whatever you want to call him. And he wrote a book called Words Matter. It's not what you say, it's what people hear. He's the guy, by the way, who changed the equation completely when he substituted the word for estate tax, he substituted death tax. The public before that thought the estate tax was just fine. But when he started talking about a death tax, everybody said, that's disgusting. So words do matter. The other thing, another book that I always recommend to people was written by a Democrat, Drew Weston, called The Political Brain. He's a guy who does functional MRI, and he has studied people's responses to words and images. And we are the product of evolution, even though some people deny it. And we are still, in some sense, governed by the amygdala, which is our emotional part of the brain. So fear is something that we all react to viscerally. Love is true too. And the argument that Weston makes is if you want to engage anybody in a conversation, engage them emotionally before you get into the actual content. Because if you do that, they'll pay attention. If you don't, if people aren't engaged emotionally, forget about it. So those of you who have fallen asleep, I apologize. I haven't done the job. I hope not too many of you. But anyway, let me get to the images. And these are just some things that occurred to me. So when we talk about MRI, you want to show people and you want to show a machine. That's what you see. And it looks, that it's not threatening. So it's something that you might want to do. And then you can say, you know where that came from? That came mostly out of physics. Oh. So Craig Venter, Harold Varmus, I think Varmus is right. Physics, biomedicine. Cars. People do respond. 40 miles a gallon, they know what that means. Forget about fuel efficiency ratings. They haven't a clue. In fact, the stickers that are on cars with numbers on them of all sorts. The Europeans discovered that people respond much more effectively if there are three stickers, a red sticker, a yellow sticker, and a green one. Green one means more miles per gallon, they tell you that. That's my checkout counter thing. It says, checkout is a breeze. There you go. And then finally, an image that I think resonates with most people, a smartphone, which whatever company you buy it from, there are more smartphones in the world today than there are people. Think about that. So I think I've had my say, and thank you very much for your attention. Absolutely.
So say a word about committee structures, if you would, or committee power. It used to be that the Appropriations Committee, the Energy and Water Subcommittee, was somebody that we all courted, that we all sort of, decisions were being made there. Wasn't an authorizing committee, it was an appropriating committee. It seems to have changed. You say a few words?
Yeah, okay, so let me just read, for those of you who didn't hear the question, has anything changed with the power of appropriations committees? The answer is yes, and for a few reasons. It used to be that everybody wanted to become an appropriator. That was the plum. Why? Because there were earmarks. So it became the choice of senior legislators. But when you take the earmarks away, and there are none today, then it means what you're actually doing is getting down into the weeds, which most of them don't want to do. So you don't always get the most qualified people vying for that committee chairmanship. Having said that, those committees are extraordinarily important. But we have not had appropriations bills that pass both houses of Congress on a regular basis for the better part of a decade. And therefore, the work of the appropriators, if you go to a continuing resolution, it means they spend their time working on this stuff, and then it's irrelevant. So that's been part of the problem. Then you get something like an omnibus bill where they actually do things, but then nobody likes that because you can't really see into the bill. You don't have the time to look at it. So it's no longer the plum. Now, with the Republicans controlling both the House and the Senate, maybe that will change a little bit. It could be that the appropriators will take their job more seriously and they'll have more influence. But that remains to be seen.
So you talked about science in the US and so forth. Science is very international. How do you see, if you expand your view a little bit, across the world, going to Europe, going to Asia, how does politics and science work together there, in your view?
It's a very good question, and I was at CERN last week talking to Rolf Hoyer about just this very issue. What happens internationally? First of all, let me just say that what's going on in the United States is not so different than what is going on in the rest of the world. For those of you who may not be aware of it, I think there's a new president of the EU from Luxembourg. And he fired his science advisor, abolished the position. Okay, so this is a worldwide phenomenon that we're encountering where scientists are no longer necessarily viewed with the dispassion that the public used to have. In other words, we're viewed with a little bit more suspicion today than we were. The other thing is that world economies have also not been thriving. And so worldwide, we have the same constriction on spending. What does that mean going forward? It means we have to develop a framework, especially for big projects, to determine where we're going to put resources across fields and how we can become more efficient in using them, how we can collaborate better. We don't want to get rid of all the competition. There's got to be a delicate balance. So in fact, the APS is going to be engaging, trying to put together a program, at least, or a roundtable to discuss this within our context. And then, as Rolf Hoyer suggested, we do this thing worldwide over a period of 2 years. The community has to do it. He does not believe, and I do not believe, that intergovernmental discussions are going to work the kinks out of the system. So you're absolutely right, and it's something that we have to pay very close attention to.
Regarding the polarization and the ineffectiveness of government, obviously that's not sustainable forever. How do you see us escaping that trap?
What do we do about the polarization? Well, there are two schools of thought on this. One is that the population is not certainly as polarized as Congress, and the other school says no, it actually is. And I haven't seen strong enough evidence on either side. The issue in Congress, I can explain it this way. Gerrymandering has enabled people to become entrenched. If you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, you don't have to worry about running in a general election. And I have a slide that actually shows some of that, which I didn't show you. You have to worry about what happens within your own party and where the challenge is going to be. Voter turnout is a huge problem. I said 33% this year, but in a primary, it dips below 10%. So the only people who vote in primaries are the people who are extraordinarily concerned about something, and they tend to be on the extremes. So you wind up with candidates, typically, who do not reflect the center of either political party. They're driven to the extremes. That's an issue. However, I would also say that the public today is so distrustful, as I said, of any big institutions, Washington in particular, that Republicans run on a platform that says Washington can't do anything. Take a look at what happened with the rollout of the Affordable Care Act. What a mess, okay? And then you have Democrats who actually do believe in government kind of wringing their hands because they also see that there are things that are not working as well as they should, and they blame the Republicans. The public looks at this and says a pox on both your houses. So I'm going to vote for somebody who wants to shake the system up. That's what we're seeing. And I'm not sure, I mean, the polarization fits into that, but it goes, this is much, much deeper than that.
Following up on the previous question, given these budget uncertainties, how does this affect the long-term international commitments of the United States to projects like ITER or an International Linear Collider?
I visited the ITER work site last Friday, and it's a problem. There's a big push in the United States Senate for the U.S. to get out of ITER. And it turns out that there is also a push among certain European countries to scuttle the project. I think ITER is not a good example of an international project. I mean, I think from what I could see, the management structure is not something that is conducive to making something work well. Bernard Bigot is going to become the new director. He's very highly regarded. He's been the head of the French CEA up until now, at least for the last few years. And he accepted the position as the new Director General with the understanding that there would be more centralized control over what happens. He was supposed to take over January 1st, but Japan has objected because they felt that their person it would appear as he was fired, which is technically, well, it would appear. I mean, it would appear that way, and it's probably true. And they've argued that that would be terrible, so this has now been delayed basically until July 15th. And I would say that you have to give Bigot perhaps a year to see what he can accomplish. And so my report, that if any member of Congress asks me, or somebody in the administration, I'm going to say give it another 18 months and then evaluate. But projects like that, of course, create a lot of difficulty because then, what do the commitments mean? And the U.S. has not had necessarily the greatest history of being a good international partner. And so going forward, that's the reason that Rolf Hoyer and Mac Beasley and I believe that we have to try to establish a framework for international projects. Without that, I think things are going to be in trouble.
Hey, thanks for a very depressing talk.
No, it's a challenge, for God's sakes.
A challenge and an opportunity. So the public's perception of science and scientists is pretty high, but yet when it comes down to making cuts, they have no problem saying, yeah, let's eliminate these. We can afford to eliminate these science programs. Do you think perhaps we should start including in that messaging of what would happen if you cut a science program? These are the number of people who are going to lose their jobs, because when you cut a program, scientists lose jobs, postdoc appointments are not renewed, grad students don't get funded. You think maybe we should use, some of the popular terms like job loss, job creation, and as part of that messaging, rather than, well, we won't make a big discovery this year, big deal?
No. Let me tell you why. The average family is struggling. Unemployment has been coming down, but it's only coming down because people are essentially being able to work more than one job to make ends meet. And so any message that says, by the way, scientists are going to lose their jobs, many people will say, well, join the club. What do you think we've been going through? I think the message has to be much more focused on how science has helped you as an individual. you know, the smartphone, I'll put mine away so it didn't interfere with the speaker, with the transmitter. Steve Jobs did not invent the smartphone. All of that came out of government research. Every piece in there. Apple spends no money on R&D. They are I mean, Jobs was a genius at figuring out what people would want. But you have to basically tell people where the things that they treasure came from. If you are injured and you have an MRI, where did that come from? Where do drugs come from? And by the way, NIH is doing a lot more of it, and a lot of work on pharmaceuticals, of course, is enhanced by work that is done at light sources. You have to tell people the story in terms that they can understand. Your life has been saved. Science saved your life. That's the kind of message. But don't talk about scientists losing their jobs. I think that's a losing argument.
So one of our challenges we've had recently is the attempt to remove the Department of Energy from having any mission related to education. To most of us, education is integral with carrying out research. And can you recommend strategies to help us combat this?
Those of you who don't know about this, the department, this is nothing new, by the way. I mean, although what was interesting is that the department itself has always felt that it had an educational mission, and very often Congress has intervened and said, no, we don't want you to do that. But in more recent years, it was pretty much accepted. Then along came the White House and said, we're going to take all the science education programs and consolidate them in the following way. The National Science Foundation would do everything having to do with the undergraduate and graduate education. The Smithsonian Institution would take care of the public. And the Department of Education would take care of all science in K through 12. So the question was, where did this come from? Now, within the executive branch, within the White House, there is something called the Office of Science and Technology Policy. John Holdren is the director of that currently. It didn't come from there. They opposed it. This was imposed by the Domestic Policy Council and by the Office of Management and Budget. And it was roundly hooted by everybody. So I think at least there are a lot of people who understand that education in science is actually done in many cases better when it's integrated with a research program. Whether the White House will back off, I think they backed off permanently, but we'll have to keep a close eye on that. But it's a very good question.
Okay, so your message about the Democrats not wanting to break the Hastert rule was rather depressing, but my question is more towards us, as far as any of us wanting to get involved in advocacy, or what is the level? Where can we help with making science something the public is more in favor of?
I never put that in my talk because I always expect somebody's going to ask the question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Glad to help.
Thank you. All right, let me say two things. Number one, what we tend to do in what I'll call outreach is we tend to teach people science, which is great. I mean, it's really good. But the people who get interested, with whom we communicate, are essentially they're the choir. They'll come to you. The biggest problem we have is convincing the public that the impact of science is beneficial. So how do you do that? Well, ideally, you'd like to do this thing through advertising, and there is a new organization that has just been stood up called Science Counts that has that as an objective. That's still a work in progress. But as an individual, what can you do? And here are some suggestions that I always give people. If you have kids, go to a PTA meeting now and speak about the impacts of science and how important it is for our society. The school board is not your audience. It's everybody else who's in the room. Another example is if you go to many members of Congress hold town hall meetings. You go to a town hall meeting, and you will probably have about a minute or a minute and a half to address the member of Congress. But your message is actually not for the member of Congress. It's for everybody else who's sitting there. Chambers of Commerce, the same sort of thing. They very often are looking for people who can come in to talk to the chamber about the importance of a particular area, science and technology. Is another way of doing that. And, you know, at the risk of boring everybody else sitting around a dinner table, if you go to a dinner party, which does not involve the science people in the science community, slip in a few words. This has to be done basically on a word-of-mouth campaign, and we all have to get involved with that.
Okay, so somewhere where we can directly address the public, not to our representatives or.
Well, I wouldn't say we stop doing that,
Yeah,
but that's
yeah,
not going
no,
to
but
that's not going to solve the problem.
Okay, thank you.
We have to do both.
Okay, I'm going to have to cut things off. If you want to get more involved in outreach, contact Matt Howard here. He's the director of SEPA. He can help you get involved. But let's thank Michael one more time for a great talk.